case just really briefly to point out some important things. Ultimately, I'm not going to point out everything. I'm going to actually ask you to do that for me as part of your weekly assignment. However, I just want to make sure that since we didn't get the opportunity to go through this in class, that instead I kind of quickly walk you through it now. So here's the case. It's 8 pages long. It seems really intimidating, but it's not. Trust me. It's actually a really interesting case, and it should really appeal to you folks as people from this community because you're probably all familiar with the hotel and Membertou Trade and Convention Center and the Pedway in question. So I tend to find it makes it a little bit more interesting when you actually know what's being talked about. But hopefully you still learn something in any case because there is a lot of background information about Membertou that I don't think many people know. And it's really interesting and important to understand that part of our history in this community. So without further ado, here is the title page. So we'll scroll past that. Just some more information about the Prudy Crawford Business Chair. Now, here I've highlighted and made some notes. So when you're trying to pick out the most important information in the case, I've broken it down by section. So here's where we've actually identified the main problem, but it doesn't actually give the full scope of the problem in this first paragraph. You will learn more about the subtle nuances that will impact this problem. You'll learn more about the key decision criteria as you read through the entire case. And I will recommend that you read the conclusion to get a better grasp of what the problem actually is, or the key issue, or the main issue. Okay, then this next section here is sort of all of the background information about the case. So you might think that this is sort of the fluff that I've talked about and that this information might be irrelevant, but it's actually super relevant to this case because all of these paragraphs will give you a better understanding of what sort of motivates Membertou, what motivates the community members, the band council, the chief, when they're making their decision in this case. I think you'll understand once you read it that there is a lot of bad blood here. The community is frustrated with the constraints that have been imposed on them, and rightfully so. It's a sort of BS situation. So with that in mind, when it comes down to making their final decision, I really want you to consider the history and what Membertou has been through up until this point. So that's something that you want to consider. All right, so I'm not going to go through this in detail. I want you to do that. I've got another note here. This is a really good example of a term that many of you may not fully understand, and I really encourage you to Google this to get a good grasp of what it means, because if you don't understand what fee simple land means, you're going to have a hard time understanding what the problem actually is in this scenario. So Google that, make sure you understand. It does kind of explain it in the case, but you want to make sure that that's one of those terms that you really dig into. And any other words or phrases that you don't understand, really make sure that you Google it. I use, what's it called? Adobe Pro, I guess. And so I can highlight and make notes within this document. You can use whatever you have, or you can print it and just write all over it. That's another option if you don't have sort of like a higher tech version of that. It's all good. You can kick it old school. So we'll keep scrolling. Okay, I've highlighted this because this line here, I want you to really consider this when you're thinking about key decision criteria. So the chief and council know that this process could really put a delay on construction, and that's important. That's important to consider when you're making your final decision. They don't want delays, right? They have a specific time frame, and it's really important to get this Pedway built so that they can make good on their loan, and you really don't want to impose any further delays. And it could be a process that's delayed, with sort of no end in sight. So I would recommend that you consider this in your key decision criteria. I'm going to keep scrolling. I've highlighted this because this is kind of a better synopsis of what the issue at play is. So they realize that there's no workaround. they have to either ask for the permit or they can just do it anyway, I guess, is the best way to put that. They can just build the Pedway without permission. So those are kind of the two main alternatives or the two main solutions that you could put forward, but I'd like to see a couple of additional solutions, like maybe combinations of different scenarios, or maybe you can think of something else that they might want to do that makes more sense to you. And as I've said, here's the conclusion. This is sort of a better synopsis than in the introduction, because now you understand all of the other factors at play, and they've really nailed down the fact that it's the difference of getting the federal permit or kind of not. And the not getting the permit is not clearly stated in this conclusion, but we're meant to understand that that is an option. This is one of those things about cases that a lot of students have a hard time with, is that sometimes you have to read between the lines and think outside the box. So the solution might not be something that is even mentioned in the case. You might be able to come up with different solutions that are sort of based on what you know, and you're using your critical thinking to come up with something that might be a totally great solution. You don't have to just go, really straightforward, like, oh, they can either build the Pedway or they don't. I want you to really use your imagination here and come up with some really creative answers for alternatives to show that you can think like a boss, basically. So I'm going to put the instructions for the assignment on Moodle so that you can submit it there. But basically, I'm asking, what do you think they should do? And also, what do you think they did do in the end? I'd prefer if you didn't Google it, but I'm sure many of you probably will because it's a real situation. But anyway, I'd just like to know your best guess. That's all.